And I also knew that I had a really strong connection to land, and particularly a piece of land that we're going to go visit today, which we're going to go see a road allowance house that I never grew up in, and yet my childhood is replete with stories from this tiny little two-bedroom house that exists within a coulee next to other tiny two-bedroom houses and other coulees. And it's this really neat, special place, a road allowance community, which just emanates stories and emanates richness of culture. There's a lot of diversity within the Métis community, and I think we'll see a good picture today of what a Southern Métis road allowance community looks like. But certainly I want people to understand that it's just one piece of the puzzle, and there are many other types of road allowance communities that exist. So we are in the Qu'Appelle Valley, and in the Qu'Appelle Valley there are a few different communities of road allowances. Road allowances generally are pieces of land, usually parallel to a road, sometimes next to a railroad. They're set aside for usage of the Crown. They're significant to the Métis people, and in fact the Métis people are often called the road allowance people. And the main reason for that is Métis people were largely disenfranchised of their land rights during the 1869-1870 resistance in Manitoba. And many Métis people fled Manitoba in search of new unclaimed land that they could settle on and still practice their culture and their rights. And when they came into places like Saskatchewan and Alberta and British Columbia, much of the land that was unclaimed was road allowance land. And so settling on a road allowance meant that they were, existed sort of on the fringes of communities. In the 60s, some of the younger Métis people started to realize, oh, the good jobs are in towns, the good jobs are in cities, and really that was what ended the road allowance communities out here, was just seeking out better economic opportunities. By the time the 60s came along, it wasn't exactly practical to make your life on geese hunting and farm laboring. The number one thing that was lost, I think, was this strong and indelible connection to the land. I think many Métis people still have a strong connection to the land, but for people like me who largely grew up in the cities, we lost the ability to build our own house, which is something that only a generation ago most Métis people knew how to do, along with all of the things that come with living off the land. So I think that we lost a bit of that, and also definitely a sense of community, because some people might look upon this place and this family as being poor, but what they had was a strong sense of community. The old people in my family wanted us to know what this place was. I had grown up with stories of this place, and in fact all of my mom's best stories are of this coulee and of this house. But they were these old people who were saying to us in unspoken words, this is a place of value, and this is a place that we want you young people to know about. And I remember really taking that in. And thinking, geez, I better learn more about this place that so many of my family stories emanate from. Métis means many different things to many different people. The biggest misconception is that people say, oh, you're half First Nations and you're half European. For myself and for many Métis people in my community and many other Métis communities, if I look at my genealogy, Métis people have been intermarrying other Métis people for 200 years. I have to go back 200 plus years to find a First Nations or European ancestor in my genealogy. And so I don't feel like I'm half anything. I feel like I'm 100% Métis. Our culture, like many other cultures in Canada, often tends to get boiled down to snippets of information, right? So when people hear Métis, they think, oh, jiggers. And my people do love to jig, and I love to jig as well, but that's only a small part of our culture. I think that the thing that people understand the least about Métis people is that in almost every important event in Canada's history, Métis people were there. When I teach Métis history, so that's the point that I try to get across to my students, is that we have a rich and beautiful culture, but our history has proven time and time again that we have helped to shape Canada, even prior to Canada even being a nation, because of course Métis people precede Canada by about 100 years. When I look at these big moments that we look back on in Canada and say that's when we became a nation, I also think those same moments, in many cases, are when Indigenous nationhoods were undone. We get caught up in a lot of times when we're talking about Indigenous communities in Canada with a narrative of trauma, a narrative that says to us that that the existence of Indigenous people is replete with suffering and hardships, and certainly aspects of it are. But the story that we don't often hear is the independence, the resilience, and the amazing contributions that both Métis First Nations and Inuit people have made to Canada's development. So for example, in the area that we're in southern Saskatchewan, many of the major highways that we drive on today were old Red River cart trails that the Métis people established during the bison hunts. Further to that, many of the farms that exist in Saskatchewan were made quite wealthy through the hands of cheap, hardworking Métis labor, Métis and First Nations labor. And so the impacts that Métis and First Nations people have made often get lost when we're talking about Canada's history. And we usually only want to talk about residential schools or some of the terrible things that have happened to Indigenous people. But Indigenous people have helped to shape this country. We've often resisted this country. And in fact, a lot of Indigenous people resist the notion of Canada 150 because many of Canada's monumental movements, such as the building of the railroad, really meant the devastation of a lot of Indigenous ways of life. And so I think Canada 150 is a time for us to look at the contributions Indigenous people have made, but also to question and to start a conversation about the existence of Canada and what that has meant to Indigenous peoples, whether it be good, bad, or ugly.